Okay, we're going to wrap up the course with a review of international trade from the macroeconomic perspective. This lecture is going to have four sections. The first one is talking about absolute and comparative advantage, kind of circling all the way back to Adam Smith. And then what happens when a country has an absolute advantage in all goods, inter-industry trade between similar economies, and then the benefits of reducing barriers to international trade. When we talk about cell phones, generally those cell phones are produced somewhere other than the United States, including Apple's, even though Apple is a US company. Um, a lot of the Apple iPhone components are actually made by other producers, including competitors like Samsung. In international trade, there's often going to be what are perceived conflicts between what's in a country's best interest and what's in a company's best interest. But again, as we look at it from a macro perspective, we're really focused on how the country's economies are benefited by international trade, even though there's an apparent conflict here between U.S. companies sourcing materials from Korea. Circling all the way back to Adam Smith, we're going to talk a little bit about absolute advantage, comparative advantage, and how those two offset each other at the macro level. So there's evidence, and the evidence is fairly strong that international trade confers benefits on economies in the global setting, in the overall setting. At the micro level, so at the firm level, the household level, there's going to be situations where international trade really can cause significant issues at that level. But at the global level, at the national level, at the macroeconomic level, there's strong evidence that international trade conveys significant benefits. Um, there's two types of advantage. The first is absolute advantage, where one country can use fewer resources to produce a good compared to another country, and where that country is more productive compared to another country. That's an absolute advantage. We're going to look at an example of absolute and comparative advantage in a moment. Comparative advantage is when a country can produce a good at a lower cost in terms of other goods. So, can the United States, for instance, produce sugar at or corn at a lower rate than oil relative to Saudi Arabia? The answer is going to be yes. On an oil side, there may be, maybe the U.S. could produce oil cheaper than Saudi Arabia, but given the trade-off, it makes sense to have Saudi Arabia produce the oil and the United States produce the corn. So in this particular case, over here in A, Saudi Arabia can produce 100 barrels of oil and zero corn, or can produce 25 barrels or 25 bushels of corn and zero oil. So it could produce anything else along this production possibility frontier, so 60 and 10, for instance. So all points above the frontiers is impossible because the current level of production doesn't support it, and below would be inefficient. So you essentially have your production possibility frontier, which you'll recall from your micro classes is sitting right along this line here. On the US side, if the US produces only oil, it could produce 50 barrels of oil. Or if it produces only corn, it could produce zero oil and 100 bushels of corn. And then it could produce, along the production possibility frontier, like, here at C prime, where you can produce 60 bushels of corn and 20 barrels of oil. So in this particular case, you build a matrix where you see what the trade-off is in terms of a unit. So the opportunity cost of 1 unit of oil in terms of corn for Saudi Arabia, it reduces by a quarter. In the United States, it's 2. So for every additional barrel of oil, it costs the United States 2 bushels of corn. For every quarter barrel of oil, it costs 1 unit of corn. So 2 units of oil to get 1 additional unit of corn, or it's essentially going to be eight times that for the Saudis. And then on the other side, in the opportunity cost of corn in terms of oil, to get an additional bushel of corn, it's going to take 4 barrels of oil to get that out of Saudi Arabia, where it's only going to require half a barrel in 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 terms of the United States. So the opportunity cost here is fairly obvious that oil is lower in terms of corn for Saudi Arabia, and corn is lower in terms of oil for the United States. So each one, if they produced at maximum level, would result in a better outcome. So if, for instance, the world was able to have the Saudis produce only oil and the United States produce only corn, you would get 100 barrels of oil and 100 bushels of corn. If each one was trying to produce for their own benefit and were producing here at level C, you would end up, world oil production would be 80 because of the trade offs here, and corn production would be 70 here. So instead of 100 and 100, which is kind of optimizing the comparative advantage, you would end up with 80 and 70, which is globally inefficient for the use of all those same resources. So again, there's an opportunity cost to trade off if a country is going to try and be completely self-sufficient in these, in this case, a pair of goods, relative to each one producing at their optimum, producing the good that they're best producing at the maximum level, and then trading for these. So we define comparative advantage as the opportunity cost of producing goods. Since Saudi Arabia gives up the least in terms of corn or produce a barrel of oil as a comparative advantage in oil production, the United States gives up the least in terms of oil to produce a bushel of corn, so as a comparative advantage in corn production. So as we kind of walk through this last example, the graph shows a production possibility frontier for Saudi Arabia after trade. So if 20 units of oil is exported to the U.S. in exchange for 20 units of corn, Saudi domestic oil consumption is reduced by 20. So we basically slide down the curve. However, it allows the Saudis to reach point D out here. So if it was at C, now it goes down from 60 to 40, but the corn that the Saudi economy is able to bring in goes up to 30 because they've given up 20 units of oil, but because they've exported it, but they're able to import an additional 20 units of corn. And so as a result, the Saudi economy now has 40 units of oil and 30 units of corn versus 60 and 10, which is ideally going to be closer to what their economy needs. And it's beyond, the key here is it's beyond the production possibility frontier. They would never be able to get to 30, even if they stopped producing oil, they would never be able to get to 30 bushels of corn if they weren't conducting international trade with a comparative advantage in oil. So again, this allows the Saudi economy to be stronger than it would have been otherwise because they're able to export this good in which they have a comparative advantage, oil in this case, to be able to import corn in this case and push their consumption of corn above even what it would be had they stopped producing oil completely. So Saudi Arabia has obviously gained from trade in this example because they're producing beyond the production possibility frontier. 40 barrels of oil and 30 bushels of corn is beyond their own production possibility frontier. That shows a gain in trade. So what happens when a country has an absolute advantage in all goods? And there's an argument to be made that this never happens, but there are situations where countries have an absolute advantage in most goods. United States being one of them, Canada being another, where we have significant natural resources as well as industrial resources and human resources to be able to produce pretty much anything that we need. And so the question is, it's a fairly typical question that needs to be asked for high income countries. And I used, the two examples of the United States and Canada. where you've got high technology, you've got well-educated workers, you've got up-to-date production processes, you've got significant natural resources. So those high-income countries can produce all products with fewer resources than a low-income country. The United States can produce most things with less human resources, for instance, than a country like India or China, where labor costs are perhaps lower and automation is also not as advanced. So even when one country has an absolute advantage in all products, trade can still benefit both sides because trade can come from specializing in one's comparative advantage instead. So here's an example with refrigerators and shoes between the US and Mexico. And again, if you took my micro class, you'll have seen this example before. And I'm reinforcing at the global level the fact that trade is not necessarily a bad thing. And as we go into a political cycle where you're going to hear a lot about tariffs and trade deficits and international debt, I want you to keep in mind as you're thinking through, hearing folks talk about those policy decisions, what implications that has as you look at things like comparative advantage and absolute advantage. So let's walk through this particular example. With 40 workers, the United States can produce either 10,000 shoes and zero refrigerators, or it can produce 40,000 refrigerators and zero shoes. And with 40 workers, Mexico can produce a maximum of 8,000 shoes and zero refrigerators, or 10,000 refrigerators and zero shoes. Point A on the graph right here is where the countries start producing and consuming before trade. So before trade, Mexico is producing 4,000 shoes and about 7,500 refrigerators. And before trade, the United States is producing about 5,000 shoes and about 20,000 refrigerators. Point B is where they end up after trade, because what you can do is trade off the difference in comparative advantage. How much is each giving up to be able to push yourself beyond the production possibility frontier? If you can get out beyond the production possibility frontier, out into here, that means that trade is going to be beneficial. Even when one country has an absolute advantage in all goods, like in the case we just looked at, both countries could still benefit from trade. Trade allows a country to take advantage of lower opportunity costs. So what's the trade-off? How many shoes do you need to trade off here to go from here to here, for instance? How many shoes do you have to trade off? Well, they go from 20,000 refrigerators to 30,000 refrigerators in the United States. You're trading off about 2,000 shoes. You're going from 5,000 down to 3,000. And then on the Mexico side, you can't even get to 30,000 refrigerators. So if I wanted to even increase, from 4,000 and let's say 5,000 refrigerators out to 10,000 refrigerators, or out to 7,500 refrigerators, I've got to give up 2,000 shoes. So the United States has a comparative advantage in refrigerator production in this particular case. So a simple example, kind of thinking about Survivor, or one of those types of shows where you got the tribes and you got six friends and they're all out, with a wide range of skills and experiences, but one person has done tons of camping, and they're also a great athlete, so they could pretty much do everything that anybody could do, and they could do it better. Um, she has an absolute advantage in all aspects of camping, but should she do all the work? Well, no. If everyone else sits around and waits for her to do everything, not only is she going to be kind of torqued at her fellow tribe members, but there's not going to be a lot of output for everybody to consume because she's doing everything and they're doing nothing. So as a result, everyone's going to benefit if they figure out their areas of comparative advantage, the area of camping where the productivity disadvantage is least, where they might be able to contribute a little bit more. And then if they coordinate their efforts according to comparative advantage, they can all gain. They can all kind of move forward because everybody's contributing something. And what we've done is taken the kind of the expert and said, okay, here's the areas in which you're going to be significantly better than everybody else, and maybe you can gather sticks better because you're athletically stronger. and you know what the best sticks are to be able to build a fire or a shelter. But John over here can go get sticks and bring them back, and you can spend your time building the fire or building the shelter because that's a skill set that John doesn't have. He can go gather sticks. You can put the sticks together in a better way. So when you look at the theory of competitive advantage, and you've got similar economies like the United States and Canada or the European Union, the theory of comparative advantage suggests that trade should happen between economies with large differences in opportunity cost of production. However, the bulk of roughly half of the world's trade involves shipping goods between fairly similar high income economies like the US, Canada, European Union, Japan, Mexico, and China. So why is that? Why are there so much inter intra industry trade between wealthy economies? Well, again, the high proportion of that is intra industry. So it's international trade of goods within the same industry. So like automotive parts or electronics. And there's two reasons for that. The first one is the division of labor leads to learning, innovation, and unique skills within that narrow segment of production. So, for instance, the Toyota produces vehicles in Austin, Texas. They also produce vehicles in Mexico. They produce vehicles in China. They produce vehicles in Kentucky. Each one of those plants produces different types of vehicles, and some specialize in engine parts, some specialize in assembly, some specialize in transmissions or seats or other goods. And by doing that, they're also able to achieve economies of scale. So you're able to build larger factories because you could go, okay, instead of, in this one spot in Austin, Texas, where I'm building Toyota Tundras, I'm going to, build the engines there. I'm going to build the transmissions there. I'm going to build the body there. I'm going to assemble it there. I'm going to put all the electronics in it and it's going to move through. That's, one plant. If you said, okay, well, I'm going to build a plant in Mexico that builds all the engines for the Toyota Tundra plus these 5 other trucks that have the same powertrain, you get economies of scale there. You get expertise there. So you have folks who are specialized in that particular component of that labor. So as a result, what happens is some countries become stronger in segments of production and build a comparative advantage in that. And so, for instance, Taiwan with semiconductors is one example. So kind of breaking that down, gains from specialization and learning and working on very specific or particular products, firms in certain countries develop unique and different skills. That specialization in a world economy can be very finely split. You can see, countries right next to each other with differences. And again, as I just talked about, you could see in the case of Toyota, where assembly of powertrains in Mexico and assembly of transmissions in the United States, you might go, well, they're just cars. Well, they could get very finely split down to, even subcomponents within those elements that are being produced in different countries because they've got a specialization in developing alloys for engine blocks. So the engine block might be produced in Honduras, and then the other engine components are produced in Mexico, and then final assemblies in Austin. And the other thing is it splits up the value chain. Many of the different stages of producing a good happen in different geographic locations. Stuff is moving around, and again, that's driven by some of those economies of scale and specialization efforts. And then you've got the value chain, which is how a good is produced and changed in stages. At what stage does value get added to that good, so that as you kind of move through the value chain, the product is becoming more and more complete. So it might be starting with casting an engine block in Honduras and ending with final assembly of a pickup truck in Austin, Texas. And through that, each of those products are moving through the value chain, additional values being added by components being added or by assembly being done. And certain countries are going to be more efficient and effective in adding value to that production process. The other one, as I touched on, is economies of scale. Concept of economies of scale becomes especially relevant to international trade when it enables two large producers to one or two large producers to supply the entire country. International trade provides a way to combine lower average production costs that come from economies of scale and can still have competition and variety for consumers. So where you're looking at a situation like the Kingdom of Bhutan, which is sandwiched between China and India, has about 800,000 people. They're not going to be able to produce everything that they need, and so it's going to be very difficult. Even if they tried to produce everything that they need, it's going to be very difficult for them to be able to do that at any scale at reasonable cost with the ability to be able to specialize relative to being able to engage in international trade. So as a result, international trade becomes important. Elements like this are why economic sanctions, like against North Korea, for instance, have some bite to them, have effectiveness, because when you take a country like North Korea and you isolate it, it then forces North Korea to either give up some of these benefits from global trade or to attempt to produce everything themselves, which then creates diseconomies of scale and makes it very difficult for them to be efficient and effective. And that's where economic sanctions tend to be used as a policy tool in order to get countries to do what you want them to do, because you're not bombing them, but you are really having a significant impact on their economy by limiting what they can do in the global marketplace. So here's a economies of scale example. Average cost of production per toaster oven. So we're kind of looking back at some micro concepts here. At production plant, S is $30, M is $20, L is $10, and V is $10. And you can see the quantity of production. So, kind of as you've got, as you get larger and larger and larger plant, the average cost of production goes down because you begin to see economies of scale. At some point, economies of scale end. You basically can't, continue this down to zero. At some point, this curve flattens, and it may even start to rise back up at some point, because you end up with some diseconomies of scale if you make the plant too large, or if you can't get enough workers that are skilled enough to be able to produce at lower cost. But most industries will have an economies of scale that looks similar to this, where the more that can be produced in a production plant or a location or in a country, the lower the per unit cost is to a point. As I mentioned, we're going into another election cycle here in the United States, and there's always discussions around barriers to international trade and tariffs, and how to protect our industries. And again, the general economist's view of this is international trade's a good thing, and you really want to reduce barriers, not in place them. And so we'll talk a little bit about the barriers to trade, and then some of the impacts of that. So tariffs are taxes that governments place on imported goods. So you might hear that there's a tariff on Chinese steel, where the United States is imposing a tax of $240 per ton of steel that comes into the United States from China, and that's to try and make the cost of steel, imported steel, higher, to give the ability of United States producers to give them a little bit of cushion in their production costs. Basically, drives the cost up to allow otherwise comparatively less efficient producers in the United States, from a cost perspective, to be competitive in the U.S. steel market. Traditionally, tariffs were used as a political tool to protect vested economic, social, and cultural interests. So we don't want to have, imported subcompact pickup trucks. We're going to put a tariff on it. We don't want to have imported steel. We're going to put a tariff on it so that we can make sure that there's U.S. steel producers. We're going to make sure that, if there's an importation of wine, that the importation of wine has a tariff on it to protect California wine and grape growers. So that's what tariffs have been used for. The World Trade Organization, WTO, is committed to lowering barriers to trade. Again, economists tend to look at barriers to trade as a bad thing. So the world's nations meet through the WTO to negotiate how they can reduce barriers to trade, such as tariffs, to make trade easier. Because again, for a large country, for a wealthy country like the United States or Canada or elements of the European Union, if you wanted to, you could be reasonably self-sufficient. It doesn't mean your economy is going to be optimized, but it does mean you can stand on your own. For a lot of other countries, like I use the example of the Kingdom of Bhutan, they can't. And so if you have a lot of tariffs, if you really make international trade difficult, especially for emerging market countries or countries that don't have the ability to produce everything themselves, it can make it very difficult for them to move from kind of poverty to middle income, and as a result, those there's billions of people who are suffering because of that. And so the WTO's job is essentially to facilitate international trade, make it easier for countries to trade with each other, and really with keeping an eye. And you'll always hear talked about with the big countries and the rich countries. It's really to make sure that the emerging economies of the world have access to these goods and services at a reasonable cost that is being driven by supply and demand, and that not by tariffs and trade restrictions. Low-income countries benefit more from trade than high-income countries do. I've just been discussing that before. This missing gains from trade, it's worth remembering 2 points. Even a small gain is enough money to deserve attention, since that increase is not a one-time event. It persists into the future. So a small gain in trade continues over time. And second, estimates of these gains based upon academic studies may be on the low side, because some of the gains are not measured well in economic statistics. It's difficult to measure the advantages to consumers of having a variety of products available at a greater degree of competition among producers. If you've got multiple producers of compact pickup trucks, it's going to benefit consumers much more than if you had one, because trade barriers have prevented the importation of other compact pickup trucks, for example. And trade between countries also involves transfer of knowledge, transfer of culture, transfer of relationships that can involve skills in production, technology, management, finance, and law. There's an old adage from the kind of right after World War I, and it was really some of the impetus of setting up the what has become the EU, where they said, armies don't cross borders where goods cross. And the kind of saying that, when countries have good trade between them, and their economies are robust because of that trade, they're less likely to fight with each other, because then that trade stops and the economies suffer. And so as a result, one of the best ways to keep the peace is to ensure free trade between neighbors, so that it really creates a very high cost to go to war. So that was part of the impetus of the EU coming out of which was the European Common Market before the EU, which a lot of that was driven by, you saw World War I, you saw World War II, and the countries of Europe said, hey, how do we get together to reduce trade barriers so that we're not going to fight each other, so that we're really working together to benefit our countries and kind of have all boats rise. It's been a pleasure having you in the course. Hopefully you've been able to pick up some things that are of benefit to you, that allow you to think more critically about economics and economic policy, allow you to debunk some of the rumors, myths, and other things that you might hear while you're out listening to your favorite political candidates. And you've got a little bit more to be able to, as you go forward with your career, to be able to kind of look at the big picture, understand how that might impact you, your job, your business, your family, and make better decisions. Thank you very much.